Okay, let's dive into one of the most unusual legal cases you'll ever encounter. Imagine this. You traced your family tree, and you discover that your DNA isn't just a record of your past, it's actually a claim to a debt so massive it could literally rewrite economic history.
The whole story kicks off with this absolutely staggering number, $100 trillion. I mean, to put that into perspective, that's more than the entire world's GDP. And it's the amount one man says the US government owes him, personally.
So, what if your DNA, your very own genetic code, was the proof that the government owed you that much money? Well, that's exactly the claim at the heart of a lawsuit filed by a man named Shane Lozenich. His argument is that his DNA itself is the ultimate proof of an unpaid centuries-old debt.
So you're probably thinking, how on earth does a lawsuit for $100 trillion even get a foot in the door of a federal court? Well, it all hinges on a very specific and pretty creative legal argument about an unwritten agreement.
The whole thing is built on this really fascinating legal concept. It's called an implied in fact contract. And what that basically means is you don't actually need a signed piece of paper. The argument is that the government's actions, over centuries, were more than enough to create a binding deal. And here's the core of that argument, right here. The lawsuit claims that for over 2.5 centuries, the U.S. government was knowingly taking and using these foundational services from the claimant's ancestors. We're talking financial backing, security, the works, and in doing so created a massive debt that they just never paid.
All right, so that's the legal theory. But what about the evidence? Let's get into the genetic blueprint, because this is where it all starts. The foundation of this entire $100 trillion claim is, believe it or not, a detailed map of the claimant's DNA. So the main piece of evidence here is this incredibly detailed genealogical report. It basically maps out what the claimant calls his genetic topology. Think of it like a biological paper trail that connects him to over 1,000 genetic relatives, a trail that spans continents and goes back centuries.
And this chart, wow, it really paints a picture of that global footprint, doesn't it? You can see these big DNA clusters, not just in the US, but also down in Mexico with some really foundational surnames like De la Garza, and then all across Europe, from the UK to Poland. It's extensive. But it doesn't stop there. The report digs way, way back, tracing these modern family lines to 3 key ancient European groups. So it's painting this picture of a lineage that starts way back in the Bronze Age, spreads out during the Great Migrations, and eventually makes its way to the Americas.
Okay, so we've got the genetics, but how does that connect to, actual dollars and cents? So this is where the claim gets really specific, assigning a particular role and a particular value to different branches of that huge family tree. The lawsuit lays out these 4 key ancestral lines, or pillars as it calls them. Each one is alleged to have provided a critical asset to the U.S. as it was forming. You've got everything from the credit of European nobility to banking infrastructure in New Jersey to military protection and even the legal frameworks for expansion. Okay, so the value was there, according to the claim. But the next part argues that this value wasn't just used, it was taken. The lawsuit outlines what it calls a history of theft, arguing these assets were systematically absorbed by the government without ever paying up. This timeline breaks down 3 key moments where this allegedly happened. We're talking about World War I, a major monetary shift in 1920, and then, of course, the Great Depression. The argument is that during these crises, the family's private value was essentially converted into public assets, all without compensating them. So let's zoom in on that World War I claim. It all revolves around this idea the lawsuit made up called sovereign misclassification. And the argument goes something like this. The U.S. basically tricked these highly skilled agents from noble European families, treating them like common laborers to get their expertise on the cheap, instead of paying them a fair sovereign-to-sovereign price. All right, that's the history, but the story then jumps right into the present day with a really wild theory that connects the claimant's own life directly to the ups and downs of the national economy. And this is where the argument takes another fascinating, almost surreal turn. The lawsuit literally puts major economic events side by side with the claimant's personal bank account. It suggests his life isn't random. He's acting as a kind of automatic stabilizer for the whole system, getting benefits when things are good and stimulus when they're bad, all to keep the U.S. economy balanced. This all leads to maybe the most unique theory in the whole case, the incarcerated dollar. Yeah, you heard that right. The lawsuit argues that a period of incarceration was an illegal taking of his sovereign economic energy, basically freezing a valuable asset and, in turn, damaging the national economy. This is what forms the basis for the modern damages claim. So, after all that, what's the end game? What is the actual goal of a $100 trillion lawsuit? Well, it turns out it's not just about getting a giant check. It's about fundamentally changing how we even recognize value in the first place. This chart breaks down that mind-boggling number. You can see the biggest chunk, 40 trillion, is for that historical sovereign credit we talked about. But look at the last two slices. 10 trillion for modern damages from things like that incarcerated dollar, and another 10 trillion to actually fund a completely new economic model.
And this is that new model. The ultimate goal isn't just about the money. It's about establishing something called a policy of truth, a whole new kind of economy where a person's story, their behavior, and yes, even their DNA have real, measurable value.
And that really leaves us with a pretty provocative thought, right? In an age where we can map our entire genetic history and track every data point of our lives, this case, as out there as it seems, really forces us to ask a huge question. How are we going to define value in the future?